In our final video discussing the parts and functions that make up a cell, we're going to talk about something that we call the cytoskeleton, which is not actually a single structure, nor is it actually present at any given cell at any given time. Simply put, the cytoskeleton is a network of proteins that are found throughout the inside of the cell. Now, normally the cytoskeleton is not actually shown in cell diagrams, because if it were, it would occupy most of the solid components of the cell, because simply put, the cytoskeleton is everywhere and needs to exist everywhere. There are actually three different varieties of cytoskeleton proteins, the first of which are what we call intermediate filaments that make up the primary components of the structural aspect of the cytoskeleton. So the first function of intermediate filaments is to actually hold the cell membrane in its proper location. And the intermediate filaments, when they do this, give the cell its proper shape. This is the reason why every single type of cell in the human body has a distinctive shape, because intermediate filaments anchor the cell membrane in order to give each cell its specific shape. Secondly, we can see that in this diagram, the intermediate filaments not just are attached to the cell membrane, but are also attached to all of the organelles within the cell, holding them in the proper location. So, for example, the endoplasmic reticulum needs to be found outside of the nucleus, because that's how RNA is able to be transferred directly from the nucleus to the ER. But if the cytoskeleton, specifically intermediate filaments, were not there to do this, then none of the organelles within the cell would be held in the correct locations in order for them to perform their function. The smallest variety of cytoskeleton protein are what we call microfilament or microfilamentous proteins, or simply microfilaments in this case, and microfilaments are actually made of an identical protein that makes up muscle. There are actually two proteins, one that gives muscle its shape, and then the other one that controls movement. And not surprisingly, microfilaments, because they're used in muscle that is used to move the whole body, individual microfilaments within a cell can also assist in the movement of that cell, and we can take a look at that in more specialized situations. The final and largest cytoskeleton proteins are what we call microtubules that have specific functions during cell division. And this is going to be the subject of an entire video series on its own, but when a cell reproduces, when its DNA and the organelles within the cell need to be divided in half, microtubules are the part of the cytoskeleton that are responsible for that. Now, expanding deeper into the cytoskeleton, we can actually see that more specialized varieties of cytoskeleton exist in specific types of cells. Now, previously, we mentioned how parts of the cytoskeleton are used for movement, and we can see if parts of the cytoskeleton are actually expanded upon, we can actually get two specialized organelles that are used for movement. The first of which we can see on this example of a cell here. This is not actually a human cell. This is a single-celled organism that is mostly found in water, and it appears as though this cell actually has hair. These are not, in fact, hair. These are specialized movement organelles that we call cilia, that basically allow this type of cell to crawl along surfaces, almost like a tiny insect or worm, using the movement of cilia in order to crawl along, but also to propel itself through water. Now, if we look at this bacterial cell here, we can see that it has much longer structures protruding from the outside of the bacterial cell wall, and these are structures that we call flagella. So flagella is actually the plural form. If we were to look at the singular form, it would be pronounced flagellum. and, well, let's just get flagellum written down here, and these function a little bit differently than cilia, whereas cilia are used to kind of crawl along the surface of a solid surface or propel itself through the water. The flagella basically act as a whip-like structure that exists to propel bacteria or specialized human cells through liquid. Now, bacteria use their flagella in a propeller-like motion, spinning back and forth, more like a helicopter, whereas the only human cell with a flagellum, which is, of course, the sperm cell that we see here, actually uses its flagellum like a whip in order to propel the sperm cell to where it needs to go, which is, of course, carrying the male DNA towards an egg containing the female DNA in order for humans to reproduce. And we bring up these organelles specifically because the proteins that make up cilia and flagella are the same proteins that are found within the cytoskeleton itself. And just to give you an idea about how numerous these cytoskeletal proteins are, we can see these are actual human cells, and each of the red, green, and blue dyes that we see in this picture highlight each of the different proteins that make up the cytoskeleton, and we can see that they are positively found everywhere within the cell because of their integral function to holding the cell together and allowing the cell to be able to move. This concludes our series on the parts and functions of cells. To test your knowledge on what the functioning of each type of organelle is, and where we actually find each type of organelle, you can try this case study here that actually looks at viruses, and what you need to do is you need to take a look at your knowledge of the different parts and functions of cells and compare that to the structures that we find of viruses based on the description that's given here, and you need to come up with a conclusion about whether we can truly classify viruses as being cells or not. And when you're done with this case study, you can take a look at the practice problems below, simply directly testing your knowledge of what the parts and functions of prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells are.